The small town of Dearborn, Michigan, had always been a place of close-knit communities where everyone knew each other's business. On the surface, the Hassan family appeared to be the picture of success. Tariq Hassan, a 35-year-old engineer, had built a career that not only supported his wife and two young children, but also brought him respect within the tight-knit Muslim community. His commitment to his work, his family, and his faith made him a trusted figure in Dearborn. Tariq was the kind of man who showed up early to mosque, worked late into the night, and never hesitated to help his neighbors. His wife, Samira Hassan, 29, was everything Tariq could have asked for. She was devoted to her children, kept their home pristine, and supported Tariq's career with the patience of someone who believed in the future they were building. Their children, aged 5 and 7, were happy, well cared for, and the epitome of what any parent would want to see in their kids. On the surface, the Hassan family's life seemed idyllic. Stable, successful, and full of promise. But the investigation that followed Tariq's brutal murder uncovered a much darker side to the family than anyone could have imagined. It was a Monday evening when Detective Amanda Price first arrived at the scene. The body had been found in the garage of the Hassan family home. Tariq lying in a pool of his own blood. His head had been savagely beaten with a blunt object, likely a wrench or a hammer. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and nothing had been stolen. The scene had the telltale signs of a crime of passion, a betrayal, a deep anger. Something personal. Amanda had been with the department for over a decade, specializing in homicides. She had seen her fair share of violent deaths, but something about this one felt different. The brutality of the attack, the fact that it happened in the privacy of the Hassan family home, and the way the scene suggested an intimate knowledge of the family's rhythms and routines, made her suspect that the killer wasn't a random intruder. This was personal. She started with Samira, the wife. She was in shock when Amanda first spoke to her, her eyes red from crying. Samira was still wearing her pajamas, her hands trembling as she recounted the events. She explained that she had been asleep when it happened, that she had heard nothing unusual. Samira's story seemed genuine, but Amanda wasn't convinced. The grief was there, yes, but Amanda had been in this line of work long enough to know that grief wasn't always a clear indicator of innocence. There was something about Samira's tone, the way she kept looking away, that made Amanda question her sincerity. Samira had spent the last few years as the perfect housewife. Her days were filled with taking care of the children, handling household chores, and supporting Tariq in whatever way she could. Yet Amanda found herself wondering, what was the motive behind this brutal crime? Tariq's death couldn't have been a random act of violence. This was far too personal, and with the lack of any obvious suspects or motives, Amanda turned her focus to the family dynamics. Samira was questioned for hours, her answers starting to reveal cracks in her story. She claimed to have been in bed early that night, exhausted from an argument earlier in the day with Tariq. According to her, they had a disagreement about his increasing hours at work, but it was nothing unusual. She mentioned that Tariq had left early for a business trip earlier that week. But there was one thing Samira had not said outright: the affair. Zade Hassan, Tariq's younger brother, was a name that kept coming up during the questioning. He was often at the house, visiting the family, playing with the kids. By all accounts, Zade was the fun, carefree sibling who had never settled down and never held a traditional job. He had made a name for himself as a freelance photographer, traveling often, living a life much more chaotic than Tariq's. From the outside, the two brothers had an interesting dynamic. Tariq, the responsible one, Zade, the free spirit. Despite their differences, the brothers had always been close. At least, that's what people thought. The more Amanda dug into Zade's life, the more she began to suspect that he might know something more about this case than he had let on. He had been spending a lot of time at the Hassan house lately, offering to help Samira with the children when Tariq was away on business. Samira had described him as a fun uncle, someone who was always around, but the detective saw a different side to the relationship. Zade's frequent visits and easy rapport with Samira were starting to raise red flags. As the days went by, Amanda's suspicion grew. The more she learned about Samira and Zade's relationship, the more it seemed like there was a much darker secret at play, a secret that, once uncovered, would turn the investigation on its head. The investigation into Tariq Hassan's murder revealed layers of lies, deception, and betrayal. Samira, the wife who had appeared so devoted, was hiding a secret affair with Zade, the brother-in-law. A quiet affair had evolved into something deeper, and when the tensions and emotions finally reached their peak, it had escalated into murder. Detective Amanda Price now found herself questioning not just the suspect, but the entire structure of the Hassan family. Could the love between Samira and Zade have led them both down a dark path? Or was there something else, someone else, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? It had been 2 days since Tariq Hassan was found dead in the garage of his home. The investigation was still in its early stages, but the more Detective Amanda Price dug, the more she felt that the case was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The crime scene had given her little to go on, no signs of forced entry, no apparent robbery, just a brutal, calculated attack that left Tariq dead in his own home. Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that Tariq's death was more than just a random act of violence. There had to be a motive, something personal, something hidden beneath the surface. That's when she started looking more closely at the family dynamics. Samira, Tariq's wife, seemed to be hiding something. In the hours following the discovery of Tariq's body, Samira's story had seemed believable at first. She had been asleep when it happened, claiming she heard nothing unusual. But something didn't sit right with Amanda. Samira's grief was too practiced, too controlled. As a seasoned detective, Amanda had seen people grieve in all sorts of ways, but Samira's reaction seemed to lack the raw, unfiltered emotion one might expect after losing a spouse in such a violent manner. As the investigation progressed, Amanda couldn't help but notice small inconsistencies in Samira's testimony. At one point, Samira mentioned an argument she had had with Tariq just before his death. They had been fighting over his long hours at work, and Samira claimed she had been feeling neglected by him. She described how Tariq's focus on his career had made her feel invisible, like she was no longer his priority. But Amanda's suspicion grew when she learned that Samira had been spending significant amounts of time with Zade, Tariq's younger brother. Zade was a free spirit, a man who lived a more unconventional life than Tariq, often moving from job to job as a freelance photographer. Unlike Tariq, Zade didn't seem bound by the rigid structures of career and responsibility. He had always been the fun, easygoing brother who would visit the family frequently. To the outside world, Zade was the fun uncle who spoiled the kids and made Samira laugh. What started as innocent visits soon turned into something deeper. Samira and Zade shared a bond that went beyond simple family connection. They started spending more time together, long conversations at night while Tariq worked late or was away on business. At first, it seemed harmless, a friendly relationship between sister-in-law and brother-in-law. But the more Amanda investigated, the more she realized this relationship had evolved into something much darker. One evening, after the children had gone to bed and Tariq was out of town on a business trip, Samira and Zade found themselves alone together. They had spent hours talking, laughing, and reminiscing about their shared memories. But that night, the energy between them was different. There was a palpable tension in the air, something unspoken but undeniable. They both felt it, but neither of them said a word. As the evening wore on, Zade reached out and touched Samira's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to spark a chain reaction in Samira. She felt her pulse quicken as Zade's hand lingered in hers. She looked at him, her heart racing, and saw that he was looking at her with a mixture of longing and hesitation. The attraction between them was undeniable. The spark that had been building for weeks finally ignited, and before either of them could stop it, they kissed. It was a kiss filled with all the passion and intensity that had been missing from Samira's marriage to Tariq. In that moment, she felt alive, desired, seen. She kissed him back, giving in to the emotions that had been building between them. That night marked the beginning of their affair. Samira knew it was wrong, that it was a betrayal of her husband and her faith, but she couldn't stop. Zade had become a source of comfort for her, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. As the weeks passed, the affair between Samira and Zade deepened. They continued to meet in secret, sneaking moments alone whenever Tariq was away on business or working late. The secrecy only heightened the intensity of their connection, and every stolen moment felt more dangerous, more intoxicating. Samira knew what she was doing was wrong, but it was impossible to deny how Zade made her feel. He listened to her, understood her frustrations, and filled the emotional void that had been growing inside her for so long. But as the affair continued, the guilt began to weigh heavily on Samira. Every time she looked at Tariq, she felt a deep sense of shame. She was betraying the man who had given her everything, the man who trusted her with his life. The lies became harder to manage, and she was always on edge, afraid that Tariq would find out. She deleted texts, avoided phone calls when Tariq was around, and went to great lengths to cover her tracks. But Tariq wasn't blind. He had begun to notice the changes in Samira. She was more distracted, more distant. She had become more protective of her phone, and he had noticed her dressing more carefully, paying more attention to her appearance. It didn't take long for his suspicions to grow. One evening, after Samira had left her phone unattended, Tariq picked it up. The screen lit up with a message from Zade, and the innocent words on the surface were enough to confirm Tariq's worst fears. The affair was real, and the betrayal was deeper than he could have ever imagined. Samira had been having an affair with his own brother. The discovery of Tariq Hassan's affair had been a turning point. What was once a quiet, seemingly perfect life was now a shattered reality. Detective Amanda Price knew the key to solving the case lay within the tangled web of lies, betrayal, and hidden emotions that had been carefully guarded until now. But as the investigation deepened, Samira and Zade's motives and actions began to reveal a chilling pattern. It was 2 days after Tariq's body had been found when Amanda finally sat down for a second round of questioning with Samira. The police had already done a preliminary sweep of the house, looking for clues, but Samira's answers had started to unravel. What she had initially described as an isolated tragedy, an attack by a random intruder, was beginning to sound more like a carefully orchestrated act of revenge. Samira had once again broken down in front of Amanda. Her tears were still fresh, but there was a coldness behind her eyes now. Amanda Price had learned to read people. The grief was too rehearsed, too convenient. Samira's initial shock had given way to a defensive posture, and Amanda couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in Samira's demeanor. Her eyes darting, her voice wavering. The cracks were forming. Samira continued to insist that she had no idea who would want to harm Tariq, but Amanda wasn't buying it. There were too many inconsistencies in Samira's story. She had been too vague about the details of the argument that had preceded Tariq's death. Samira kept referring to Tariq's demanding work schedule as the source of their tension. But Amanda knew from the case file that Tariq had always been a devoted husband, if not emotionally distant at times. The real source of the rift was something else. It had to be. Amanda turned the conversation to Zade, Samira's brother-in-law, who had been at the house frequently in recent months. She noticed Samira flinch at the mention of his name. For a brief moment, her expression hardened before the mask of grief returned. "What about your brother-in-law, Zade? Was he around a lot in the weeks leading up to Tariq's death?" Amanda asked, her voice steady. Samira hesitated. "Zade has always been a part of our family. He's been a good uncle to the kids. He came over often to help when Tariq was traveling for work." Amanda could sense that Samira wasn't being entirely truthful. Zade's frequent visits were too much of a coincidence, especially when they had started to coincide with the emotional distance between her and Tariq. Her story was beginning to unravel. She kept avoiding the question about Zade's relationship with her, deflecting, but Amanda could feel the tension in the air. After a moment of silence, Samira's resolve cracked. We were close, but it was nothing. Nothing more than friendship, just someone who understood me." She trailed off, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time Samira had admitted to something more, but even then, the admission was guarded, unwilling to let the full extent of the truth come out. Amanda pressed. "Was your relationship with Zade really just a friendship, or was there more to it, something deeper?" Samira, her face flushed with guilt, nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "It wasn't supposed to happen, but yes, it was more. I had an affair with him, but that's all. It's not related to what happened to Tariq. You have to believe me. I didn't kill him." Amanda took a deep breath, her mind racing. The affair was the motive she had been looking for. The betrayal ran deeper than she had first thought, but the pieces didn't quite fit. Samira's confession made things clearer, but it also raised more questions. The affair had been going on for months, and now that Samira had admitted to it, Amanda had to piece together the rest of the story. What happened that night? Was Zade involved in Tariq's murder, or was there something more? It had been nearly a week since Tariq Hassan's brutal murder. The investigation had gone in circles, with the police piecing together fragments of evidence, but still no clear answers. Detective Amanda Price knew that the clock was ticking. The community was demanding answers. The family, what was left of it, was falling apart. Samira had confessed to the affair with Zade, but the story didn't add up. If this was simply a crime of passion, why had Tariq's murder been so violent? Why had it been staged in such a way that it pointed to Zade? Amanda sat at her desk, reviewing the evidence. Zade had been the last person to see Tariq alive, yet his story didn't fit. The police had tracked his movements, but the timelines didn't match. Zade's alibi, claiming he had left the house before the murder occurred, was shaky at best. He was nowhere to be found in the days after the murder, and the detectives had yet to track him down. His sudden disappearance had only raised more suspicion. If he had fled, it was clear he had something to hide. And yet, Samira's behavior continued to nag at Amanda. The more she dug into Samira's past, the more it became apparent that her guilt wasn't just about the affair. She had never truly come clean. There was something else, something more hidden, that Samira wasn't ready to reveal. Amanda's instincts told her that this was not just a simple domestic crime. She had to dig deeper. The next morning, Amanda called Samira in for another round of questioning. Samira's story had already been examined several times, but Amanda knew there was more. She wasn't sure if Samira had killed her husband, but the lies, the deception, and the emotional distance between her and Tariq had created the perfect storm. And Zade, the man Samira had been having an affair with, was the catalyst. When Samira entered the interrogation room, her face was pale, her eyes sunken from days of sleeplessness. Her grief seemed genuine, but something in the way she carried herself, an edge of defensiveness, made Amanda wary. She took a seat across from her. "Samira," Amanda began, her voice steady, "we need to talk about your husband's murder. You told us everything you knew about the affair, but you've left out a lot of details. You said Zade was just a friend, someone who helped when Tariq wasn't around. But that's not the whole story, is it? Samira's hand trembled slightly as she clasped them together on the table. Her eyes flickered briefly, and she sighed, almost as if she had been expecting this moment. "No, it's not the whole story," Samira admitted quietly. "But I never thought it would come to this. I never wanted him dead." Her voice cracked. "Tell me what happened that night, Samira," Amanda pressed. "We know that you and Zade were together the night of the murder. We know the affair was ongoing, but we also know Zade had been to the house before Tariq was killed. The timelines don't match up. He says he left before it happened, but we don't believe that." Samira's face tightened, but she didn't look away. "I don't know what Zade did. I was with him. But I didn't ask him to kill my husband. I never wanted this. I never wanted it to end like this." Amanda leaned in closer, her voice soft but direct. "Zade didn't just leave that night. He came back, didn't he? That night, after the kids were in bed and you were alone, you two argued, didn't you? What happened?" Samira's breathing grew heavier, and for the first time she seemed to crack under the weight of her own guilt. Her voice faltered. "Zade, he didn't mean for it to go this far. But Tariq found out about the affair. Zade confronted him in the garage. Tariq was so angry, so hurt. He wanted to tell everyone, expose us. He threatened to destroy everything, and then Zade snapped. It wasn't planned, Amanda. It wasn't supposed to go this far." Amanda felt her stomach tighten. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. The motive was clearer now. Zade, driven by a mix of jealousy and fear of exposure, had acted impulsively in the face of his brother's wrath. But what happened next, what Samira revealed, was even more chilling. "He hit him with the wrench. Tariq fell, and he didn't move after that," Samira whispered, her voice shaking. "Zade didn't know what to do. He panicked. He didn't mean to kill him, but Tariq was dead, and we had to cover it up." Amanda sat back in her chair, stunned. She knew that Samira hadn't killed Tariq, but she had played a role in what happened. Zade, the man who had been her lover, had murdered his own brother in a fit of rage. And Samira had been complicit. She had kept the secret for so long, but now the truth was coming to light. As the confession came pouring out, Amanda knew she had a breakthrough. Samira had just revealed her complicity in the murder, her affair with Zade, the escalation of the fight, and Zade's brutal actions in the garage. But there was still one key part missing. Where was Zade now? The detectives had managed to track down Zade's last known whereabouts, but his phone had been off for days, and his apartment had been abandoned. The more they searched, the clearer it became that Zade was on the run. He had disappeared after the murder, likely fearing the consequences of his actions. It wasn't long before the search for Zade intensified. He became the prime suspect in his brother's murder, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Did Samira know more than she was letting on? Had she been an accomplice? Or had Zade acted entirely on his own? The days following Samira's confession were a blur of disbelief and sorrow. Detective Amanda Price knew the investigation was nearing its conclusion, but the unraveling of the Hassan family's secrets had left her disturbed. Zade had fled, and Samira's guilt was palpable, but there was still no closure. Samira sat in her living room, now a shell of the woman she once was. Her confession had come too late. The weight of the truth, the affair, the murder, was too much to bear. She had betrayed Tariq, her husband, and her family, yet she was not the one who killed him. Zade had acted out of jealousy, fear, and a deep sense of betrayal, but his violence had destroyed everything. Days passed with no sign of Zade. He was a ghost, his phone turned off, his apartment empty. Amanda's team followed every lead, but he had vanished, slipping through the cracks of the investigation. It wasn't until a week later that they received a call from a neighbor. She had seen Zade leave the Hassan house the night of the murder, around 10 p.m., but the timeline didn't match. Tariq had been killed between midnight and 2 a.m. The mystery deepened. Finally, a breakthrough came. Ibrahim Mansour, a family friend who had been close to the Hassans for years, came under suspicion. Ibrahim had always been fond of Samira, but his affection had turned into obsession. When he discovered the affair, his jealousy ignited. He confronted Tariq in the garage that night and, in a fit of rage, struck him with a wrench. Ibrahim's confession shattered the remaining illusion. He had plotted the murder for weeks, hoping to remove Tariq from Samira's life, believing that she would finally turn to him. But in the end, his obsession had led him to kill not just Tariq, but his own future with Samira. The Hassan family was torn apart. Zade had fled, leaving behind a legacy of shame, and Samira, once a beloved wife and mother, was ostracized from her community. Her life would never be the same. As for Ibrahim, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The investigation was over, but the scars left on the family and the community were permanent.